Maria, it's great to see you today.
Great to see you, Jason. Thank you for having me.
So, Maria, you're from Moscow, but moreover, you're the daughter of a former prime minister of the Russian government under Yeltsin. So, let me ask you, do you think it's true that the Kremlin only understands force and that's the best way to communicate with it?
I think it's true that the Kremlin only understands force. And yeah, I think that's the only way to communicate with Kremlin.
But why is that? Why doesn't the Kremlin operate like other countries, say European countries, that are much more involved and much more interested in developing normal bilateral and diplomatic relations? Why does the Kremlin only understand force?
Well, why is a very interesting question, but I would say the following. We have a practice, and by practice it already happened. We know that everything else didn't work. There are so many efforts to work around Russia, to make talks with Russia, to negotiate with Russia, to appease Russia, to listen to Russian narratives and trying to understand them, but it never worked. It never worked. It just became wars and wars and wars, and then violence escalated. And if you look historically at other countries, when countries, empires, regimes resort to violence, I don't see many examples where this could be resolved by something else, by clear force. It's not resolved by words, it's not resolved by negotiations, so I don't understand why there should be an exception for Russia, why there's always somebody looking for an exception for Russia. I think it's the same thing that happens everywhere when something like that happens.
So, is it because of the imperialism inherent in Russian society that Russians respond best to force? Do you think that there's a relationship between those two?
I think, well, it's a question for sociologists and culturologists. I just know it's a fact. It's factual. Why this happens, I don't know. It's like an interesting question, why this happens. I think the environment is quite aggressive inside Russia. I think people have low social trust, and they usually, when people, a lot of them feel afraid. A lot of them, for example, in Ukraine, people are very independent. They're very strong. If the state just created conditions for them to operate, people would be happy, very entrepreneurial. They could work, do whatever they need to do. And Russia, and it's also the geography you made, some places, if the state is not there, there's not going to be this place. People are just going to die there because there's nothing to do there. They don't have a fertile soil. They don't have a geography that allows them to be interconnected in the world, for example, like Ukraine has, which in any region you have neighboring countries, and you can do business and go there, and you're interconnected in the world. So they're isolated. There was Russian regime was not just violent and cruel against other countries. It was violent towards the southern population, and I guess that also had a huge impact on people. The civil war, then the Stalin regime and the repressions he did. So I think it's probably that way, and the level of aggression is very high. Even in Ukraine, if you look at the way the society operates, people are much softer. They're much more, and they don't like to resort to violence. And even if you look at political persecution, and even when people go to jail, people understand, there is a limit to what you can do to a person. You cannot kill the person, you cannot torture a person, you cannot be violent toward children. So it's very humanistic in Russian. Russian culture is much more aggressive. Mm-hmm. And even if to prison for 25 years, if something just die, it's I don't know why is that, but it's definitely like that.
But Russia as a whole, historically, through its leaders, who typically had the great added to their names after they died, took over large swaths of territory. Expansionism was a huge part of Russian history. But why do Russians today have such an interest in size and growth of sort of imperialism? Where does that come from?
Well, I think that comes from the idea that they're the first one in size, and I think that makes them proud. Well, countries find pride in different things. Some of them find pride in their democracy, their institutions, their way of life. Well, that's the thing they can be proud about, their size. It's probably the only thing they're number one in the world. And yeah, that's, I guess, the answer. Also this idea, yeah, at least we're the biggest one.
So you yourself, growing up in the nomenclatura, that is the upper class of the Soviet Union, where the elites and the intellectual elites were treated well, treated better than the average person in the Soviet Union. And you are a product of that. You grew up with that, both sides of your family held the prestigious roles in the Soviet Union. So in that period of time, say in the 90s or in 2000s, did you ever meet people that are currently in leadership of Russia? For instance, did you ever meet Vladimir Putin?
I actually met Vladimir Putin. It was in '99 when he just was about to become president. It was after the elections. He came to SPS party. Nemtsov was leader of that party at that moment, and he went to congratulate the party because it won parliamentary elections. So I actually met Putin. Yeah, and he tried to charm everyone, and he was quite saying right words, and he was actually successful in that, quite successful. So I wouldn't say that they come with the face of a devil. It's of course, if you listen to the words Putin says now, it's quite clear by the words he says. But at that time, he would come like a regular person and say right words that any other leader could have said.
And Dmitry Medvedev, you've met him?
I've met Dmitry Medvedev when I was working in Kyiv region. He was the president at that time, and he also seemed like a nice guy, and he also said right words. So I'm saying it's not like you can differentiate it, and it's much more important to look at the actions, not at the words, because the words sometimes they can be just fine, and they know how to say the right words. And I think it's all the Russian regime is about saying one thing and then doing another thing. So it's important not to listen to what they say, to their narratives, and much important is to look at what they do.
So throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s, many had hope that Russia would pursue a democratic trajectory. And you yourself were very active in the democratic opposition, having worked with people like Boris Nemtsov, Garry Kasparov, Alexei Navalny, and others. At what point do you think, though, that Russia reached the point of no return? At what point did Putinism become the state religion?
I would say to me, I went in position 2004. And to me, just that time, it became clear that everything is wrong. But when I look at this nowadays, I understood that actually there wasn't a time of democracy. Honestly, there was the sentiment for democracy was a very sentiment within a very narrow group of people for a very short-lived period of time. So I think it's not that it actually changed. I think it's that believed it can change. We believed it changed in the 90s, but it actually never changed. I think the way the economy worked, it changed. It came from like an efficient Soviet economy to a market economy. But I don't think that actually the feeling for democracy in Russia, as opposed, for example, in Ukraine, feeling for freedom and democracy is very strong among people. In Russia, it wasn't. So I don't think that Putin did something specifically dramatic. Well, the only thing that probably he did when he took it to a different level, it started with annexation of Crimea and the war with Ukraine. So he took it to a different level in that sense. But in terms of democracy and Russia becoming an authoritarian regime, I think it was almost never a democracy, or the period was so short-lived. So I don't know if it counts, actually. It was short-lived and didn't last, and nobody actually wanted it. That's why Putin was so successful. And it's not just Putin who like magically came and made Russia that way. I just say it's the way that Russia was. And in the 90s, the Western countries, they chose to believe that Russia became a democracy, but that was mostly words. If you look at the people even who surrounded Yeltsin, mostly KGB guys. The only reforms usually they were interested they did were market reforms, of course, because the regime needs money to operate, and people need money to live on that. But the feelings for democracy, for freedom were never strong. So I think it's not that actually, it didn't change, it evolved. And it evolved with Putin, of course, at a very fast pace, definitely, because it coincided with his psyche. But nothing specifically connected to personality. I think it's more historical way how all this operates. And actually, when I look at the 90s, when we say, okay, Russia became democracy and started market reform, it had to dissolve Soviet Union. And it came because they couldn't afford to support Soviet Union. They didn't have enough means to support the Soviet Union. And they needed another economy because it was impossible to operate anymore. There was not enough food on the shelves, and they didn't have enough money, even for their military operations, whatever they needed. So it changed. It was called democracy. Everybody bought into that. I don't know why everybody buys. I also bought myself this narrative. But I was young and inexperienced, but I don't know why all the other, for example, the United States bought it or other Western countries bought it so fast. Probably they wanted to buy it. Probably they wanted to believe it.
So Russia, since Putin took office, do you think was headed on a trajectory the whole time towards authoritarianism? And what do you make of the current Putin regime? Some have called it an international criminal syndicate, in that it doesn't only engage in terrorism here in Ukraine, but also works with terrorist actors such as Hezbollah and Hamas, with Iran and Venezuela, and other countries around the world. How would you describe the current Russian government?
Well, they're war criminals, definitely, so we could say, and they're a regime. And different branches of that regime, it could be FSB, it could be the economic branch. They're like just different bodies, parts of the same body. They're almost the same, so we could say that they're organized group that operates internationally, operates with warfare, operates with propaganda that is unfortunately sometimes effective in different countries. They operate with their poisonous narratives that they try to communicate all the time. So of course they're in that sense they're criminal in nature, and they do try to operate internationally as much as they can. You know, whenever you let them get into, they get into and they start to operate. So in that sense, I think it's the right definition. We could call it terrorist state as well. I think it would be fair as well.
So, some in the Russian democratic opposition since the start of the war have said things like sanctions should not be applied to Russia or they should not affect average citizens. And they've also done things like to help raise money for their own projects, saying that contributing money to Ukraine was an error, that it was not helpful. What do you make of that? What should somebody who opposes the Putin regime in Russia do today?
So first of all, I strongly disagree. And I also, we need to take, I guess, the words of these people. They came from, well, they came from a regime. They were threatened. Some of them came from prisons. So I would take their words with some understanding, you know, of how people who just came out of some violence and repression, what they say, you know, probably they have Stockholm syndrome, probably it's their wishful thinking, probably it's just honest mistake, probably it's the idea that they can please some theoretical constituency in Russia that actually doesn't exist. So take their words for the same. But I don't think that people who came from Russia or came from Russia, even from Russian prison, they're experts on what's the best way to fight Russia. I think there are still Russians that are in mental prison still, I guess.
So, when you look back at the 1990s in Russia, how would you apprise your own father's work as prime minister and the reforms that he instigated?
Well, unfortunately, these reforms actually were quite efficient in terms of the market reforms. Well, he believed that market reforms and the appearance of institutions, private property, are going to actually eventually evolve the regime to democracy, because people who have property will want to maintain and keep their property. They're going to need for the business to operate, to have institutions that allow this property to exist. That was the idea. But at the end, what it happens, so without other institutions that are political institutions, the free courts, freedom of press, it doesn't work that way. Economy just becomes an efficient instrument of the regime. So unfortunately, what he was able to achieve is to give, with the reforms and all the economic reforms that happened in the 90s and later, it was able to make the regime even more efficient, because it gave the regime some economic means and some economic background to and foundation to operate.
So that's interesting. So you would disagree with the premise that a country having more capitalism will lead to it having more democracy. Is that right?
So unfortunately, yeah, unfortunately the reforms actually worked and Russia became a market economy. And it has kind of a capitalist economy, but it didn't become a democracy. It didn't become friendly towards the neighbors. It didn't change the way people think and how politics operate. So it just become a regime that is more efficient because it has money, unfortunately. And I think all the premises about like market brings democracy or development and countries becoming richer brings democracy. I think in that sense, Russia's demonstration that it not always works or doesn't work at all. I don't know what's the right way to put it, but in that sense, it's a clear demonstration of that.
So now that Ukraine is more actively taking the war to Russia, having invaded Kursk Oblast, but also having regularly done drone strikes across Russia on critical infrastructure, including on oil refineries, how do you think Russians perceive that? I mean, do they drive to work every day, look out the window, and see a burning oil refinery for days on end that the firemen cannot put out and think that this is normal? Or do they realize perhaps things are really getting off track here in Russia?
Yeah, I think if they look at something that's burning, or if they look at the drones, or they look at like direct consequences that come to them, you know, they probably start to understand something. But what do they make out of it? You know, it's like they understand that something is wrong, but what they're going to make out of it? Support the regime even more, have even stronger sentiments against Ukrainians? I don't know, but I would say that I guess in order to understand what Russians think, like the best way, the average Russian, to aggregated Russian, is to work to look at the propaganda. It's actually, I think they believe what's said in the propaganda. Even people who don't watch TV, they believe what is said. So it has to be taken at face value. So you have to look for something else. Is they believe that they say they believe, and it's quite obvious. So they're going to shift the blame somewhere. They're going to find somebody who is to blame. Or it doesn't mean that if they see that something is wrong, they're going to come to some conclusions. It has to go to some higher level of troubles, and also people have to feel it economically. So if the regime is going to collapse or have economic problems, when people are going to feel it more in their pockets, for example, if the sanctions are more efficient, or they uh, they have like problems by themselves that they created themselves. And I think is that way the perception can change. Otherwise, they will see something, but what they're going to take out of that is going to be completely different that you would logically take out of seeing something like that. Because as I saw with Russia, it's like there are some events and actions, but then people come to crazy conclusions. Like even during the war, how people assess this war, how they shift the blame so easily. They shift it on Ukraine. They forget that they started it. They still are war deniers. They see that something is already like burning Russia that and burning that and drones, and still they deny that there is war. Like they still say there is no war in Ukraine. So it's like you have soldiers who are dying. You would guess, if you have so many soldiers dying, the population is going to feel it and be against it. But it doesn't happen that way. So it doesn't like follow the normal logic, I guess. And I think propaganda is very strong, and people believe that they choose to believe, and they choose to believe something that frees them from blame, and something that creates hopes. When they're going to see that these hopes are fruitless, and they see that life is going to get worse and worse and worse and worse, then it's when they're going to understand that something is wrong. But it has to become worse and worse and worse.
As you know, Ukraine is currently occupying more than 1,000 square kilometers of Kursk Oblast in Russia. Now, do you think for the average Russian that's very important, or do you think it's much more Moscow-centric? And if something were to happen in Moscow, it would have a greater impact?
Russia it's a country that is in Ukraine. If something happens in Ukraine, everybody feels it. And for example, Kursk, I would say that a lot of Russians, they don't care about Kursk actually, as many Ukrainians think how Russians care. So it's just part of the territory. As you mentioned, it's a huge territory, and people don't feel so connected, they don't have these social connections, social trust, and social empathy even towards each other. So in any place of Russia, everybody say that this place is not exactly Russia. Moscow is not Russia, St. Petersburg not Russia, Siberia is not Russia, Vladivostok not Russia. Where is Russia? Nowhere is Russia. So if you just hit some regions, it's important for these regions. But to make a difference, it's important to hit Moscow or something around Moscow, actually. It's always like it happens in Russia, It has to come to the capital for something to start happening in the brains of people. So they would feel, oh, then it's actually wrong. Because otherwise they could say, okay, it's just Kursk region. Or it's something else, It's not like the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
So to hit that, to have the idea, it has to be either everywhere. It has to bring some economic damage, which is going to be noticeable for the elites first, and then by people.
Mm-hmm.
But then it has to get closer to Moscow. Definitely, I think even 200 kilometers from Moscow would make it. Something if it would like continuously happen around there. That's how I think the country psychology operates. It's very Moscow-centric.
You came here in 2015. Earlier had been the Maidan, and the Russian invasion of the Donbass and Crimea had already been launched. So when you came here, you began working with Masha Saakashvilli, who had been the president of Georgia, who was working in the Odessa region of Ukraine, and you worked with former President Petro Poroshenko. And so you've seen both the Ukrainian side and the Russian side over the past decade as relations between the two countries has deteriorated to nothing. What would you say has changed in public perception in the two countries during that period of time?
Well, I wouldn't call that relationships. I don't think it's like, because after 2014, it was not something that could be called relationship, It's just force and aggression against Ukraine, which escalated even more. I haven't been to Russia for 10 years, so I don't know actually, how it like changed, but I understand now that the feelings that people had, these imperialistic feelings, the feelings of not wanting to accept that Russia has to be like a peaceful country living on their own, that Russia has to, for some reason, dominate over the neighbors, it was strong always, even in the 90s. The biggest sentiments about the Soviet Union were connected to the idea that the empire dissolved. And mostly people would not remember about Kazakhstan or even Belarus. They would always speak about Ukraine. Ukraine, for some reason, or probably because it's like a very nice, rich country that they liked themselves, probably the way it looks, the way it's located, whatever, it's just something nice that they wanted to have. It was also part of some obsession for Russia. For them, it was the symbol that the empire is not even, it's not there anymore. So it wasn't Kazakhstan, it wasn't Kyrgyzstan, it was Ukraine. And for them, the existence of the empire, and for some reason, empire is something that is very dear to Russian people and was always connected with Ukraine. And the sentiments towards this idea of domination or being this huge, great country were always very strong. But then it escalated, of course, to a level from sentiments, it escalated to actions, and then it became a real problem.
So in 2004, 2005, you were already coming down to Ukraine, which had the Maidan Revolution at that point. Now, how did Russians perceive that? How did they perceive the Orange Revolution? How do they perceive all the democratic growth that occurred in Ukraine? Why does that upset the Kremlin so much?
It's a mystery to me. I cannot understand why. I know that it was always present there. The sentiment, the strong sentiments against Ukraine being an independent country were strong from the 90s. And it just evolved. During the Orange Revolution, it was a surprise to me when why would you be so troubled by an independent country trying to work their way through democracy, fight their way through democracy, and overthrow the regime they didn't like? What would be the problem about that? Why Russia had to be so upset about that? Why Russia had to interfere so much? Why Russia tried from the beginning, even if you look at the 90s, Russia always tried to, for some reason, in one way or another, with all the means that it had, control Ukraine, corrupt Ukraine, like be against independence of Ukraine, for example, forbid Ukraine to enter some international institutions. Why? Why the Baltic countries could get into NATO and why Ukraine couldn't get into NATO? And why everybody in the world, to me, is like more interesting question. Why Russians did it? Because they're imperialistic in nature. And for this to change, a lot of things need to change, and all the way they think and operate needs to change. It's a huge work. It's like, I don't know how this is going to happen. And that's definitely not going to happen by itself. But why they were allowed to do that? Why they were allowed to think that? Because if you look at what Russia tries to say, it's always the narrative that they try to bring towards the United States and the Western countries that, well, Russia wanted to cooperate so much, but the West promised them something. For example, that Ukraine is going to enter NATO, and then that's why something like it escalated or Russia started to take some actions. But actually, I think that Russia was treated very fairly in the 90s. They were able to get away with anything that they did in the Soviet time. There were no retribution, reparation, not even like clear apologies. They were taken to all international institutions. They kept their place in the UN Council. They got all the nuclear weapons. So they were actually like everything that they could have like dreamed about, they had it already. So when their like extra demands came, I don't know why everybody was like complicit or like was like taking it very seriously, because there was no need to do it, at least in the 90s. There was no need to play these games. And unfortunately, everybody just wanted to play these games and follow Russian narrative. How Ukraine is different from the Baltic states? Why Baltic states have the right to independence and enter, or Poland, to enter European Union? And why Ukraine wouldn't have it? They came from the same Soviet Union. They're not so different. The sentiments of people are the same. So I don't understand, and I understand why this approach towards Russia and the West, and I think it's still persistent. It's still after these years, 3 years of this war that people see with all the atrocities, with all these bombings, with all the things they do against the civil population did. It's like still there's a lot of voices that I hear that are looking like trying to find explanations, why Russia had the right to do it, how they think, what is. So it's, I think, the important thing, it's not to follow Russian narrative, not to listen to the narratives, and to think clearly about what is actually going on. And I think that's now and for future is very important. In order for Russia not to resort to violence, it has to be stopped, and it has to be stopped by force and by all collective efforts. So when something like the dissolution of Soviet Union happens again, it's important to take action and not to get away with everything, so easily as it happened. And I think that was one of the reasons why this imperialistic behavior persisted. They never paid for it.
So, how will the Putin regime end? What do you think?
And I remember the interview he gave when the submarine Kursk sank. He said it just sank. I think it's going to sink.
Just sink.
Just sink.
We can hope so soon.
Yes.
Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you.